Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Pluralsight's webinar on how to create a mature cloud practice. I'm Jill Flett, Marketing Manager here at Pluralsight, and I will be your host for today's session. I'm joined by Jeremy Morgan, a Consultant Marketing Manager and Tech Blogger. Jeremy is going to take you through the migration to the cloud and showing us the best way forward. If you have any questions as we go through the presentation, pop them in the Q&A box and we will come to them at the end. I will now hand you over to Jeremy, who will kick us off.
Hello, thank you. So today we're going to talk about cloud maturity, and I will talk a little bit about just moving to the cloud, going from on-premise to the cloud, and kind of what to look for, and some kind of hang-ups, things like that. A little bit about me. My name is Jeremy Morgan, and I'm a Pluralsight author, and I built 5 courses for IT Ops for Pluralsight. I've been a developer professionally for about 20 years or so, and I've worked with a variety of companies from startups that couldn't keep their lights on to Fortune 100 companies. I've spent the last few years as a DevOps engineering consultant, mostly in the Windows space, and so I've enjoyed being brought on stage to celebrate awesome product launches, and I've sat in a data center at 2 a.m. eating cold pizza, hacking away at something, trying to figure out how to keep from getting fired. So kind of been there, done that, seen a lot of different things, and learned a lot from it. So no question, the era of cloud computing is here, and what was considered a nice to have or something to shoot for is now the foundation of any technology organization. And the big question is why? Why should organizations spend money, resources, and people's time to move everything to the cloud? Is it so we can chase the latest fads or tell everyone we're on the cutting edge of tech? No, there are actually very practical reasons for cloud migration. With the emergence of DevOps and changes to how we deliver software, speed has increased. So customers aren't waiting 6 months or a year for a batch of features anymore. We expect constant improvement. If your competition is developing software features faster, you're at a disadvantage. And cloud technologies are designed around the concept of continuous delivery. Another reason for moving to the cloud is decreasing spend. So lower costs have always been important to any business, and reducing your expenses means more cushion from unexpected events, the ability to increase investments and grow, things like that. And cloud services enable you to only pay for what you need. And so long-term, they'll provide cost savings that traditional infrastructures just can't match. And security risk increases by the hour these days. So moving everything in our lives to the internet gives motivation to bad actors to access that data. Cloud services provide security and peace of mind that's expensive to implement with traditional infrastructure. And the final reason, today's world, your business can double the amount of customers in a day. When that happens, you don't want to be lugging servers into a data center and plugging them in. With the cloud, you'll be moving a slider or having automated scripts that add capacity for you. So migrating your infrastructure to the cloud is an investment in your organization. Now, an important thing to understand is organizations aren't changing to adapt to the cloud. The cloud is adapting to changes to the way that we develop software. So most cloud services are designed as a reaction to a changing process. For instance, engineers aren't moving to virtualized servers just because they're available on the cloud. Many organizations have been using virtualized servers for years because it improves the software development process. It makes your infrastructure more scalable and more stable. And cloud providers are now offering virtual servers at a lower cost with automation tools to assist with provisioning. So long story short, it's the organizations themselves, us, that are driving change, and the cloud providers are providing the best solutions in reaction to those changes. So today we're going to talk about migrating your organization to the cloud. The first thing we'll explore is the idea of cloud maturity and what it means for your organization. First, we'll talk about where you are now, how you can determine where your organization is currently in their cloud migration. Then we'll talk about where you want to be. Very few organizations are living 100% in the cloud, and many don't need to be, but we'll look at how to assess that. And finally, we'll talk about migrating your infrastructure and what that looks like, some common pain points and how to address them. And then we'll do some questions at the end. So what is cloud maturity? It's a benchmark that determines where you're at in your transformation from on-premises infrastructure to a cloud-based infrastructure. And it's far from a straight line path. It's full of pitfalls and lessons and stuff like that. So when we talk about cloud maturity, we'll start with the spectrum that we're looking at. Now, at one side, we have an infrastructure that we're all familiar with. Our servers are hosted in the building in the data center. We have servers set up and they're named after Greek gods or Disney characters. And we have a smart group of engineers that are keeping them running 24/7. We have web servers, database servers, file servers, you name it. And they're all right down the hall in that noisy room with the dim lights and the raised floor. Or maybe it's like a repurposed broom closet. Now this is 100% on premises, and we refer to this as on-prem. And this model has served us well for decades, and frankly, it still serves companies well. This is one end of the spectrum. Now on the other end of the spectrum, we have everything in the cloud. We have very few servers per the old definition. Most of our applications run in services. We don't have database servers, we have a data service, and it scales up or down when we need it. So at this end of the spectrum, there isn't a single machine in our building. It's all hosted in the cloud. Now our goal in cloud transformation is to go from here to here as quickly and cheaply as possible, right? Well, spoiler alert here, very few organizations are 100% in the cloud, and many of them don't need to be. But we need to determine where on the spectrum our organization resides and where we want to be. And as I mentioned, it's not a straight line from on-prem to cloud. This is our Pluralsight Cloud Index, which represents where you're at on particular vectors of cloud adoption. Each point on the map represents a step in moving to the cloud. And we're going to break it down into phases so you can determine where you're at now. You can be really far in one direction and at ground zero on the other. And we'll come back to this index frequently. So here are the phases of cloud maturity when you're going from an on-premise solution to the cloud. The first step is experimentation and foundation. This is where you're starting to consider a move to the cloud and kind of planning your strategy. Phase 2 is when you're in the process of starting to move things over. And then phase 3 is repetition and expansion. You've moved things over, you have a system in place, and you're operational on the cloud. But now you're just moving small parts of your system over. And phase 4 is when you've made all the moves that you need to make and you're needing to observe and maintain the cloud-based infrastructure. So let's determine where we're at. If you're in phase 1, you're living in this part of the matrix. You want to move to the cloud and you're making plans to do so. So let's look at some of the vectors here that we have on this map. First, we'll talk about executive buy-in. And this is a critical vector, but it's kind of a wild card due to organization size. It could be that you're the head of IT and development and you're the executive, or you may be in a spot where there are many layers of permissions needed. So this part of the phase involves getting permission to move to the cloud, and getting executive buy-in isn't always easy. But the move to the cloud can be fairly expensive. Not only are you incurring new costs from the cloud provider, you're paying engineers to work on that transition, and you're throwing away all that expensive hardware in the data center when you're done. So decision makers want to know if this is the right move to make. Most organizations go through a kind of a try and see approach here. You need to run experiments, do proof of concepts, things like that. If you're at the very beginning of this phase, a good tactic is to take a service or application with minimal dependencies and create a plan to move that to the cloud. Now, the reason that I call out dependencies rather than risk or how heavily used the application is because an application with a lot of dependencies will take time and resources to move, and it's more likely to fail. So you don't want your most problematic application or service to be the one that determines whether or not you move to the cloud. So that application that only runs on Windows Vista and churns out some report with long abandoned software is not the one that you want to choose for your proof of concept app. You'll want to choose something a little more portable. Now back to our index, we're going to look at these vectors in the order of priority, or at least the priority that I've seen assigned out in the wild. So we'll talk about hardware. Now in phase 1, you have all your servers on-prem. They're either in a data center on site or your building or a co-location facility. And these servers are bare metal servers that are mounted on racks. You may have database servers, file servers, mail servers, things like that. If they're hosted off-site, you'll have a VPN to access them. If they're on-site, they're probably within your internal network. And you may have web servers as well that are exposed through a firewall or DMZ. And this is how we've done things for decades. And what does your data situation look like? Well, in phase one, all of your data is on-prem. It's on file servers and database servers that reside on-site on physical machines. Now, ideally, when moving to the cloud, you'll move towards virtual hosted database servers or eventually database and file services. Now, your virtualization is a big determiner of maturity. For decades, we had physical servers with names and assignments, and that worked great. But then came much larger machines that host small servers inside of it. So now we have virtualization in the cloud. So you can spec out a server with a web interface and just kind of choose what you want and press build. So where are you at on this vector? Are you still using bare metal servers, some virtualization, or everything in the cloud? And in this vector, where are your applications hosted? Are they traditional web-based or client-server architecture apps that are running on-site? At this stage of maturity, it's likely the case that you haven't moved a lot of applications to the cloud. And how's your continuous integration? When engineers commit code, what happens? This can be entirely independent of the cloud. By the way, you could be in phase one and be 100% on-prem and still have full integration with your source code. But this is one of the indicators of maturity. And how about continuous deployment? Are your applications still delivered by manually copying artifacts to production servers? Do you have some form of automation? So some organizations are still kind of slow to automatically deploy software with good reason. If you haven't established a resilient system with easy fallbacks, you need a human being to kind of be a gatekeeper to keep software from breaking your system. And finally, how's your observability and monitoring? Are you gathering logs and doing it all manually, or do you have services that monitor uptime, performance, security? This is another vector that can be done 100% on premises. But you'll need third-party applications to do it rather than relying on the observability of cloud providers, which are often far cheaper. Now, in the first stage of cloud maturity, you'll likely have no application monitoring happening. You'll be reliant on logs and sharp engineers to keep an eye on things. So this is what phase one looks like. And this is phase two, phase 3, and 4. And naturally, this is nowhere near how it works in the real world. Your mileage may vary. You'll likely end up with something that looks a little more like this. But we still like to think of it in phases, and we'll talk about what living in each of these phases is like. Now, one common thing you'll see here is experimentation. If I had to narrow down one thing that was required to be successful in a cloud transformation, it's experimentation. You have to try things, observe them, and make decisions based on the results over and over and over again. And this doesn't stop after you've moved to the cloud. If you're all the way in phase 4, you're probably experimenting even more than you were before. This is kind of a permanent thing. So if you know where you are now, you have to determine where you want to be. So phase 1 is basically square one. You have all your servers on premise, everything lives there. Your deployment is likely manual, and you don't have a lot of monitoring or observation going on. So where do you go from here if you want to move from phase 1 to phase 2? Here are your first steps. First, you need to establish a proof of concept. Now, this is a small project to kind of sample a bit of a cloud. And it's something like a small application that's running on a server that you move to the cloud, or a website. And this serves two purposes. So you can prove it to yourself and your team that you're able to make the step, and you can prove it to management. So the second step would be establish an innovation team, or you can name it whatever you like. But take a group of engineers and task them with being the go-to folks to move to the cloud. Just the act of creating a team makes it real. Both to the engineers and others in your organization. If there's a team dedicated to this, then it's serious. And if possible, do a cost-benefit analysis. Did you save costs by moving to the web? Did you accrue a few more? Is it worth more money to make the switch? And don't forget to factor in total cost of ownership, things like electricity, keeping the lights on, replacing hard drives on those computers on-prem, things like that. Now, phase 2 is a migration and standardization phase. You've proved that you can move something to the cloud and you're looking to the future. So you've done a few proof of concepts, you put a few apps up there, things are working and in production, ready to go. Now in this phase, you'll have a hybrid infrastructure. You'll have some things that are cloud-based, but most of your applications are still hosted on-prem. Now a common pattern here is when you have a company with significant internal infrastructure, they will move the public website to the cloud and then leave the rest on-prem. So your deployment in this phase is pretty manual. Most of your artifacts are being moved manually from development to staging to production. Now, as far as executive buy-in, at this point, it's increased, but management is still kind of watching how things go, and they're not fully committed to the cloud yet. So how do we get out of this phase and go from phase 2 to phase 3? For this, you'll need to do the following. Look for patterns. And what I mean by this is look for things that work. For example, if you discover a way to script and automate a database transfer from your on-prem server to a cloud server, take notes on that. Tweak the process and use it to build the next service better. You'll learn the nuances between on-prem and cloud, and you'll want to note each of those. As you migrate products or groups of applications to the cloud, each one should be easier than the last. Which leads me right into the next point, which is increase your automation. So now is the time to automate in this phase. So if you think about it, when you want to automate your software deployment, for example, there's no pressing need. You aren't going to spend a lot of time on it. Fires come up, priorities shift. Engineers tend to work on other things. However, if you need to manually move a piece of software from an on-prem service to the cloud, it's the perfect time to create some automation for that. So you dust off those PowerShell or Bash skills and start automating your push. And you can use this as a part of your CI and CD process later. And this is also a prime time to increase observability. So this is another thing that gets put off by software teams in our old model. You know, why bother setting up observation and things like that when we have work to do? The good news is whichever cloud provider you choose out of the big ones, they will have tools for observing your servers and applications. So after you install and you migrate over and switch to them, just make observation part of your workflow. And it's one of those things you'll thank yourself for it later. So this is my favorite phrase to be in, repetition and expansion. At this point, you're fully hybrid. You have a mix of applications on-prem and in the cloud, including a lot of production applications and mission-critical stuff that's now up on the cloud. You'll notice some renewed excitement from your innovation team at this phase. I call this repetition and expansion because with every new project, you're repeating stuff that worked in the past and you're expanding the infrastructure. So each project keeps going faster and faster. And at this point, you and your innovation team look like rock stars. Things are coming up, they're being built fast, features are being pushed out fast. Everything goes really well at this point. So you've conducted experiments and taken notes. You have your best practices in place. Naturally, you've set up some automation as part of the adoption of the cloud. Your CI and CD are going faster and faster, and they're likely maturing at this point as well. So you may even have like a clear path from committing to trunk and having those changes pushed to production automatically. And at this phase, leadership, the executive buy-in, leadership is committed to the cloud. There's no talk of going back or anything like that, or will this work? They know it's going to work. They're only asking when everything will be moved to the cloud at this point. And the expansion may stop. You may move over most of your applications and then have a few that stay behind. Many organizations stay in this phase for a long time, and that's okay. You may not ever go 100% cloud, and you may not need to. If you're able to operate reliably, deliver features and fixes to customers fast, then there's no reason to kind of stress out about a few applications that are still on-prem. A few manual processes here and there also might be okay. Your results will vary. So to move out of this phase, to go to full cloud, You'll want to make your delivery fully continuous. Deployment, integration, testing, everything. So when something's merged into main or trunk, it should pop up in production shortly after. Getting this locked down and solidified allows you to focus on other things. So there should be very little human intervention for delivering software here. And everything that's migrated should be well documented somewhere. I know that there's been a trend in engineering away from documentation, but for these cloud transformations, documentation is really important, because just because you moved it to the cloud doesn't mean you'll never touch it again. The more you document, the more you'll allow new engineers coming on to understand the system, and it will make life easier if you decide to move that to another cloud service. And there's that word again, experiment, over and over. Try new things. Will moving from a database server to a database service run faster? Does it scale better? Is it cheaper? These are the questions to ask. You want to optimize what you have in the cloud as much as possible to increase the value of that investment that you've made. So let's say now you're in phase 4, observation and optimization. Very few organizations can really say they're on the edge of each of these vectors and they're 100% cloud, but it's possible. So here you're in a cloud-first environment. All of your applications live in the cloud. Any new application that's created is automatically created in the cloud. All of your software is delivered through continuous integration and deployment, and it's done at a very rapid pace. So testing is automated and baked into the workflow. And at this point, leadership is fully invested in the cloud, and your job now is to maintain and improve that investment by optimizing continuously and providing full visibility into the operations. So where do you go from here? At phase 4, you're fully cloud, you're done, right? Not even close. Now the job is to keep this machine running successfully. So you must improve and focus on observability. Leave no stone unturned here. Every part of your process should be monitored and reported on closely, even if you rarely use it. Profilers, testing tools, chaos generators, all of these things should be a part of your everyday life now. And focus on building self-healing systems. These are systems that recover from errors and fix themselves. Build some failovers, things like that. Have systems that inject chaos into our architecture or into our infrastructure. Have it shut down services and see how long it takes to repair them. This is MTTR, or mean time to recovery. And focus on scaling. So what happens if you go viral overnight? What happens if you acquire another company and you have to move the traffic to your infrastructure? Focus on smart ways of scaling up. So we'll use the following factors to determine what your level of cloud maturity is. Hardware infrastructure. Does it live on site in a data center, fully in the cloud, or somewhere in between? Data. Is your data on-prem with servers, all in the cloud, or somewhere in between? Applications. Are they hosted on a traditional web server, on a traditional server, somewhere hosted in a cloud service, or both? And virtualization. Are you using conventional bare metal machines, all virtual, or kind of a mix of both? Deployment and integration. Is it fully manual, fully automated, or somewhat of a mix there? And finally, executive buy-in. Is management reviewing proposals, or are they giving you the green light for 100% in the cloud? These are the vectors you'll use to determine where you're at and where you want to be. So here are the main takeaways that I've touched on. And these are the things that you'll need to do in order to be successful for any cloud transformation. Experiment. Try new things and see what happens when you convert a service or find a new way to automate something. This is just the best way to keep things moving is just constantly experiment. Fail often and learn. If everything you do is succeeding the first time you tried it, you probably aren't innovating fast enough, and your competition will. So take risks. And when you fail, try to learn from it. Things like blameless postmortems are the best ways to keep moving forward. And finally, create a culture of learning. And what I mean by this is encourage your team to experiment and fail often, as we've just said. When they fail, don't chastise them or threaten to fire them. Encourage them to learn from mistakes and move forward. Encourage them to experiment. Any member of your team can contribute greatness to this process. It may be your architect with 30 years of experience or a college intern with a great idea. Listen and consider everyone and make them feel like it's safe to contribute ideas and safe to kind of pitch in on these things. So thank you so much for attending this webinar. I love the fact that people are excited as I am about things like cloud migrations. So I will be taking questions from the audience now. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was great. As Jeremy said, if you've any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box. So the first one I can see there is, can we achieve horizontal scaling in Amazon RDS specifically for Oracle databases?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. Could you repeat that one?
Sorry. Yeah. Can we achieve horizontal scaling in Amazon RDS specifically for Oracle databases?
So Oracle databases, I'm not entirely sure about, but I know that for most things, the horizontal scaling is definitely possible. Once you've got things kind of set up and dialed in, you don't necessarily have to scale out everything all at once. And I'm not exactly familiar with that particular service, but I do feel like that's probably something that can be horizontally scaled.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Just another one, how is the initial investment to move to cloud managed, especially when everything is working on-prem perfectly? Why would someone invest that initial money for a transformation? Is it really a roadblock?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And one of the biggest reasons for making that change, even if things are running great and they're running awesome, the biggest reason to move to the cloud is putting out new features and bug fixes faster than your competition is. So in certain industries and areas, on-prem works really great and it works awesome. But if it's something where you're driving innovation and you're making a lot of changes, you want to have that push button architecture. So you're making small changes in the code and then pushing a button and having it pushed to production, within a sprint or within a week or even a day. And so mainly that investment is driven off of features and the ability to deliver them quickly.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And do you have any recommendations or general ideas for using multi-cloud platforms for things like backup and disaster recovery, and once you have some services in the cloud?
Yeah, for that, the biggest thing you want to do is just experiment with each service and take a list of features that you desire from that service. So using the backup as an example, you'll want to nail down each of the things that you want from backup. Do you want to be able to FTP the files over? Do you want to use VPN? Take a list of each of those features and then just experiment with each of the cloud providers. If one of them jumps out and it stands out really big as like, this cloud provider has everything we need and want, then that's the one you want to experiment with first, and you may just end up using that one. Say, if everything you have is hosted in Azure, but S3 is a little bit better interface and works better for you, which I'm using that example as one that I've seen quite a few times, where I've seen a lot of things in Azure for applications, but people want to use that S3 service because it's easy to use and it's powerful. So that's just kind of gather up those features that you want and experiment with them with a small test set.
Okay, and just another one here. What is the main objective to move into public cloud? Is it because of cost or agility?
The main objective for moving is, I would say, probably agility. There is a cost savings and it's not upfront, and that's what makes the people apprehensive about moving to the cloud. Is upfront, it is not cheaper to move, but once you get everything moved and you've got your servers retired and things, your day-to-day operations will be a little bit cheaper. However, it takes a couple years to get there. So the agility, I think, is the big primary point, like being able to just be very agile, to be able to change things, to be able to push out features, things like that, because you won't see a return on investment right up front with a move to the cloud.
Okay. And does going to the cloud automatically mean you take microservices approach while coming from monolith apps?
Not necessarily. So that's one of the things that that a lot of organizations strive for. I'm not one of the people that says microservices is the end all be all for everything. But you don't have to take a microservices approach. You can do a monolith approach in the cloud, especially if you do a transformation moving from virtual machine to virtual machine. And what I mean by that is, say you have a virtual machine on premises that's running an application, and you just want to take that and put it into a virtual machine on the cloud. And so then you have the advantage of scaling up, of duplicating that machine easily, things like that, but you can still keep that monolith architecture. If it's working for the company and it's doing a great job, then there's no reason that you would have to push it into a microservices model.
Okay. And is it possible to have a sample demo of migrating on-prem database applications to the cloud in future webinars?
Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. I think that's the one sticky point for a lot of these migrations, is just moving databases from a database server to a database service, or even just moving from an on-prem server to a cloud server. So I'll definitely write that down as an idea, because I think that would be really helpful.
Okay, and then maybe just the last question, if we don't have any more come through, what is single cloud versus hybrid cloud?
Single cloud is basically you're using one service. So you've got everything in Azure. Everything is kind of there with the same services, the same architecture. A hybrid cloud is more like you've got some things in Azure, you've got some things in GCP, you have some things in AWS. And a lot of that's personal preference from the architects and people who set it up. So for me, my personal preference is I like to look at solving the problem first. So not necessarily coupling yourself to one cloud provider or one specific technology. I don't believe by spreading cloud providers, you're protecting yourself from downtime or performance issues, which is sometimes one of the misconceptions out there. You know, if we have everything on Azure and Azure goes down, then we're kind of dead in the water. But generally, Azure as a whole doesn't go down. You know, GCP doesn't go down. AWS doesn't go down. I think the biggest advantage to doing a hybrid cloud is kind of like I mentioned earlier. You know, we have a bunch of .NET apps, and they run really well, and we have Cosmos DB services. So we have all this stuff in Azure, but we really like the fact that we can connect to S3 and store our data there, and we love Glacier storage, and we love the Lambda model that we found over here, things like that. So it's basically just going between the three big cloud providers or even a small provider. And I think if it's solving a problem that you have effectively, then there's absolutely no reason you shouldn't go with all three of the providers or even a small provider. Ask yourself what problem you're trying to solve first and foremost. So.
Okay, right, that's great. I think that's it for all of the questions. So thank you very much for your time, Jeremy, and thank you to everybody who joined us and asked some questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And if anyone has questions that they didn't want to ask live or anything like that, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just send me a message, or on Twitter at Jeremy C. Morgan. And I'm more than glad to field questions that way. Just kind of send me a private message. And if I don't know the answer, I'll probably be able to find someone that does have the answer. So
that's great. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.